Okay, so you know how everyone's always talking about butter versus margarine?
Yeah.
And it feels like every time you turn around, someone's telling you something different about which one you should actually use.
Right.
So we thought we'd try to get to the bottom of all that today, really cut through the confusion.
Yeah. I think that would be really helpful for a lot of people.
I'm Brian, and this is The Deep Dive brought to you by the Detox Health YouTube channel.
Hi, everyone.
And with me today is Chelsea, a really fantastic nutrition expert who's going to help us sort all this out.
Happy to be here.
Now, before we jump in, if you find this deep dive helpful, please do share it around with your friends and family.
Yeah, spread the word.
It really does help the Detox Health YouTube channel grow and lets us bring you more of these really in-depth discussions.
Definitely.
Full disclosure, I've always preferred butter.
Okay.
But today, we're going to put personal preferences aside and really dig into the science behind both butter and margarine.
Feels good.
We're going to look at what they're actually made of, the different ways they can affect your health, especially your heart health, and try to give you some clear, actionable information so you can make the best choices for yourself.
Awesome.
To do that, we're going to be drawing on some great articles from Harvard Health, Healthline, and Medical News today.
Great sources.
So, Chelsea, let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly are butter and margarine?
Well, butter is something that most people are pretty familiar with.
Yeah.
It's a traditional food, a dairy staple, and it's made by churning cream or milk fat.
Okay.
So it's a pretty simple process when you get down to it. And from a nutritional standpoint, the key thing to remember about butter is that it's mainly saturated fat. And that's really been the main reason it's been kind of scrutinized over the years, because of those concerns linking saturated fat to a higher risk of heart disease.
Yeah, that's been the big knock against it for a long time.
Exactly.
So then what about margarine? It was supposed to be the healthier alternative, right?
Exactly. Margarine was created specifically to mimic butter in terms of how it tastes and how you can use it.
Okay.
And traditionally, it's made from vegetable oils, which are high in polyunsaturated fats.
Which are the good fats.
Yes, generally considered to be healthier for your heart.
Got it.
So because it wasn't from animal fat, it was initially recommended as this heart-healthy alternative to butter.
Interesting.
But here's where it gets a little tricky.
Okay.
The way that older margarines were processed actually created some unintended consequences.
Uh-oh.
To make those liquid vegetable oils solid at room temperature, they used a process called hydrogenation.
Okay.
And a major byproduct of hydrogenation was these high levels of trans fats.
Ah, trans fats.
Yeah.
The worst.
Yeah, they got a really bad reputation, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Because they were shown to raise your LDL cholesterol, which is the bad kind, and lower your HDL cholesterol, which is the good kind.
And that's a double whammy for your heart.
Exactly. Not a good combination.
Not at all.
But thankfully, things have changed a bit in the food industry, and newer margarines often use a process called intrasterification instead of that full hydrogenation.
Okay.
And this avoids creating those trans fats.
So that's good news.
Yeah, definitely a step in the right direction.
So the big difference here is that butter is basically just concentrated dairy fat.
Right.
And margarine is made from vegetable oils. And it goes through a lot more processing.
Exactly.
Okay, now you mentioned that the whole idea of fats and heart health has shifted over time.
Yeah, for sure.
Can we unpack that a little bit?
Right.
Because it seems like what we're supposed to believe keeps changing.
Yeah. And that can be really confusing for people.
Totally.
So for a long time, the thinking was pretty simple. Saturated fat equals bad for your heart. And trans fats were even worse.
And that made sense based on what they knew back then.
Yeah, the research seemed to support it at the time.
But what's interesting is that even though everyone was telling people to switch from butter to margarine, there wasn't actually a lot of evidence that doing that actually lowered your risk of heart attack or heart disease.
Yeah, that's what the Harvard Health article pointed out. And it's kind of surprising.
It is surprising.
You know, they pushed margarine as this healthier choice, but they didn't really account for the dangers of those trans fats.
So it's kind of like they jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire?
Yeah, in a way.
So now things are a little more nuanced?
Definitely.
It's not just as simple as butter is bad. Margarine is good.
Not at all.
Harvard Health actually says that the whole butter versus margarine debate is kind of a false issue these days. And they recommend focusing on limiting your overall intake of saturated fat and avoiding trans fats altogether.
Yeah, regardless of where they're coming from.
Right, so it's not about the food itself, it's more about the type of fat.
Exactly.
So you're saying that just cutting out butter and eating a bunch of white bread, for example,
Right.
probably isn't going to make your heart any healthier.
Not really, no.
Okay, so the Healthline article kind of backs this up too, right? They talk about how the studies on saturated fat have actually had mixed results.
Yeah, it's not as clear-cut as they thought it was.
Interesting.
But what they do emphasize is that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, that does seem to be linked to a reduced risk of heart disease.
Okay.
But here's the catch. They also say that just replacing it with carbs or protein doesn't seem to have the same benefit.
So it's not just about taking something away, it's also about what you're replacing it with.
Exactly. You got to think about the whole picture.
Right.
And then the Medical News Today article brings up the American Heart Association's advisory from 2017,
Okay.
which still suggests that saturated fat does raise LDL cholesterol, but they acknowledge that it's not as bad as trans fats.
Okay.
And it doesn't seem to affect your HDL cholesterol in the same way.
Interesting.
So it's not all bad news for saturated fat.
Right.
But the big takeaway from that Medical News Today article is that nutritional science is always changing. What we know today might be different from what we know tomorrow.
That's for sure.
And that can be tough for people trying to stay on top of things.
Absolutely. It feels like the goalposts are always moving.
Yeah, I get that.
Okay, so we've talked about what butter and margarine are and how our understanding of fats has changed. Let's talk about some of the potential benefits of butter.
Okay.
I know there's a lot of buzz about grass-fed butter these days.
Yeah.
Is there anything to that?
There can be some nutritional advantages to choosing grass-fed butter over conventional butter.
Okay.
Because of the cow's diet, grass-fed butter tends to have higher levels of certain nutrients.
Like what?
Well, one is vitamin K2,
Okay.
which has been linked to bone health and other things.
Interesting.
It also tends to have more conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA.
What's that?
CLA has been suggested to have anti-cancer properties, and it might even help with reducing body fat.
Wow.
Then there's butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that may have anti-inflammatory and digestive benefits. And finally, it often has a slightly better ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids compared to regular butter.
So that all sounds pretty good.
It does.
But I feel like there's a but coming.
Well, it's important to remember that we usually eat butter in pretty small amounts.
Yeah, a little pat here and there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even though it might have more of these beneficial compounds, it's probably not going to make a huge difference in your overall nutrient intake.
Okay, so those extras are nice, but they shouldn't be the main reason you choose butter.
Right.
Okay, so what about the potential downsides of butter?
Well, as we've discussed, the biggest one is that high saturated fat content.
Yeah, around 50% right.
That's right. And while there's still a lot of debate about whether saturated fat directly causes heart disease, it's generally accepted that it can raise LDL cholesterol in some people.
Oh, okay.
However, some scientists believe that saturated fat might also raise HDL cholesterol, which is the good kind.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they think it might change the size of LDL particles to a larger, less harmful type.
So it's not as simple as saying saturated fat is bad for everyone.
Exactly. It depends on the individual.
What about cholesterol? I know that was a big concern for a long time.
It was. Yeah. Butter is high in dietary cholesterol because it comes from animals.
Right.
And for years, people thought that eating lots of cholesterol would raise your blood cholesterol and lead to heart problems.
Yeah, I remember hearing that.
But now we know that for most people, dietary cholesterol doesn't have a big impact on blood cholesterol.
Interesting.
Your body regulates its own cholesterol production pretty effectively.
Okay.
So the guidelines around dietary cholesterol have become a lot less strict.
That makes sense.
But people with a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia, they have genetically high cholesterol.
Okay.
They might still need to be careful about how much cholesterol they're eating.
Got it. So we've covered butter pretty thoroughly.
I think so.
What about margarine? What are some of the potential health benefits there?
Well, one of the biggest benefits of modern margarines is that they're high in polyunsaturated fats.
Okay, those are the good ones, right?
Generally, yes. And the specific types and amounts will depend on the vegetable oils they use.
Like if it's made with soybean oil or something like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
And as we talked about earlier, replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat has been linked to a lower risk of heart problems.
So if you're trying to cut back on saturated fat and get more of those good unsaturated fats, swapping butter for margarine could be a good move.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
Also, some margarines are now fortified with plant sterols and stanols.
What are those?
They're also called phytosterols, and they're basically plant compounds that are similar to cholesterol.
Okay.
And they can help lower LDL cholesterol by competing with cholesterol for absorption in your gut.
So they kind of block the cholesterol from getting into your system.
In a way, yes, but even though they can lower LDL cholesterol, the research on whether they actually reduce your risk of heart disease is a little less clear.
Hey, really?
Yeah, and some earlier studies even suggested that they might have some negative effects on blood vessel walls.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Definitely.
So it's not a guaranteed win, even if it improves your cholesterol numbers.
Right.
Okay. And of course, we have to talk about the potential risks of margarine.
Yes.
And the big one is trans fats.
Yeah, we've touched on that a bit, but it's worth repeating.
Even though they're being phased out, it's still something to be aware of, right?
Absolutely, because historically those trans fats were a big problem with margarine.
Right, from that hydrogenation process.
Exactly.
And we know they're linked to heart disease and other health issues. Thankfully, the FDA has banned trans fats in processed foods now.
Which is great news.
It is, but it's still important to check labels.
Absolutely.
And look for partially hydrogenated oils in the ingredients list.
Yeah, because that means it still contains trans fats even if the label says 0 grams.
Yeah. Sneaky.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So always read the fine print.
Good advice. What about those omega-6 fatty acids? I've heard some concerns about those too.
Yeah, some people worry about those because many margarines, depending on the oils they use, can be high in omega-6s, like sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil, things like that.
Yeah.
And while omega-6s are essential fatty acids that we need, some experts think that eating too many, especially in relation to omega-3s, might promote inflammation in the body.
Okay.
But the research on that is still pretty mixed.
So it's not as clear-cut as the trans fat issue.
Yay.
Okay. So with all this information, how do I actually make a healthy choice at the grocery store?
Well, the best choice for you really depends on your own individual needs and preferences.
Okay.
If you're leaning towards margarine, the most important thing is to choose one that has 0 grams of trans fat on the label.
Okay.
And make sure it doesn't have partially hydrogenated oils in the ingredients.
Awesome.
You might also consider looking for margarines that are made with healthier oils, like olive oil.
Okay.
Those will be higher in monounsaturated fats, which are good for you.
What if I'm sticking with butter?
If you prefer butter, you could go for grass-fed butter, which might have a few more nutrients.
Right, we talked about that.
But no matter what you choose, the key is moderation.
Okay.
Don't go overboard with it.
Moderation is always good advice.
It really is.
So what should I be looking for on those nutrition labels?
Definitely pay attention to the saturated fat and trans fat content.
Okay.
Compare different brands and see how they stack up. Also, look at the calorie count per serving, especially if you're watching your weight.
Right.
And it's good to see what types of fats are listed. You want to see more polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats.
Got it. Are there any other alternatives I should consider?
Oh, definitely.
Like what?
Well, olive oil and other vegetable oil-based spreads are generally considered healthier.
Okay.
They're naturally rich in those good mono and polyunsaturated fats. And the Harvard Health article mentions stanol-based spreads, which can be good if you're trying to lower your LDL cholesterol.
Interesting.
And don't forget about avocado.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's creamy and it's packed with healthy fats.
Awesome.
So, yeah, you've got options.
So it sounds like the spread itself is just one small part of the whole healthy eating picture.
Absolutely. Your overall diet, your lifestyle habits, your genetics, they all play a role in your heart health.
Right. It's not just about one food.
Exactly. Focus on a balanced diet with plenty of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins. Get regular exercise. Don't smoke. All those things are going to make a much bigger difference than whether you choose butter or margarine.
That's a good point to remember.
Yeah, it's about the big picture.
Okay, so to sum things up for everyone, the butter versus margarine debate is definitely complicated.
It is.
Trans fats are bad news. Avoid those.
Agreed.
The impact of saturated fat is still up for debate. Butter and margarine both have their pros and cons.
Yeah.
And reading those nutrition labels is super important.
Absolutely.
The best choice really depends on your individual health goals and what you need. This has been super helpful. Chelsea, thank you so much for breaking all this down.
My pleasure. It's important for people to feel like they can make informed choices.
So there you have it, folks. We've taken a deep dive into the butter versus margarine debate.
We have.
Looked at the latest science and hopefully given you a better understanding of how to make the right decisions for yourself.
Definitely.
Remember to consider your own dietary needs and always check those nutrition labels.
Yes, please do.
Now, here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
We've spent decades arguing about butter versus margarine.
Yeah.
But maybe the real focus should be on eating more whole premiums, less processed fats, as part of a healthy diet.
I think that's a great point.
It's not just about the spread, it's about the whole picture.
Exactly.
Make sure to subscribe to the Detox Health YouTube channel.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.